All right. I think we have, okay. We've already engaged in part one of this two debate event. Part one was David McQueen and Grayson. They engaged the topic for about 2 hours. And it was a great discussion. It was a great debate. First debate to this two-part event. So if you haven't checked that out, obviously, once this entire event is over, since we're doing it live, make sure to go back and watch. With that, Grayson, we're going to hand it over to you now for a response.
He needs to explain why the fossils are in the order that they're in. And it's not adequate to try to question if they're really in that order, because anyone with eyes can go, find me an elephant in the Cambrian. I mean, you don't find that, and you need to explain why not. And it's not so simple as saying, oh, well, you've got the bottom feeders on the bottom layers, and you got the birds on the top, because we find bottom feeders, we find marine life at every single layer. You can find in this upper Cenozoic, you can find bottom feeders, you can find plankton, you can find clams, you can find all the things that TRock thinks are at the bottom Cambrian. So he needs to explain the order of the fossil record tonight.
The idea is that the continent was setting here, and I'm using North America as the reference frame here. The continent was setting here. It had a bunch of granite slab underneath it with actual, what I believe, and I'm totally open to this discussion, but what I believe is actual open aquifers with water in them. Now, it could be also that it may have been more like saturated mineral content or something like that with a lot of water. But in either case, there's a lot of water underneath the continent where it started out. And so what looks like has happened is through a series of meteoric bombardment, these aquifers that I'm describing, they go out past the continent shelf, out into the ocean a ways, and through bombardment of meteorites, those have been fractured and broken open. And so what I expect should happen is, if these are the aquifers under here and the continent sitting here, out here away from the coastline is where the fracturing starts, and that's where the water pouring out, i.e. fountains of the great deep mentioned in Genesis, that's where they come out from, is somewhere out here away from the coast. So what that does is, in a very simple mechanistic sense, is it makes the continent lean that way first. Instead of coming straight down or doing anything else, it's got to kind of lean towards the direction where the water is escaping, because that's where the pressure drop is the highest. So essentially what's eventually going to happen is it's going to lean that way, and then it's going to start following that collapse of those aquifers across the seafloor. So explanation number one, why is the Cambrian on the bottom, so to speak? It's because once this happens, once that thing takes a dive and starts sliding, it's essentially just scooping across the bottom of the seafloor. And as it's doing that, you've got, instead, now you've got the water itself flowing over the continent, but it's doing what I've termed hydrofoil. I believe it's an accurate term to use here, but it's creating a hydrofoil of fluid flow over the top of the continent here. And because it's sediments, the sediments are necessarily down close to the top of the would-be dry continent, just because of the density difference between them and the water. So you get these sediments that necessarily hug close to the top of the otherwise dry continent. Now, what's important to understand about that process is, if you study fluid dynamics at all, one of the things you learn about, particularly if you go down a path if you go down a path of engineering for doing things like architecture, for construction, you have to learn quite a bit about fluid flow when it comes to nature and like lakes and dams and rivers and that sort of thing. But what you find out is that those sediments that are necessarily towards the bottom of the water column, they are a powerful abrasive. So what those
1 minute.
Thank you. What those seafloor sediments are doing are they are literally scrubbing as they're coming across like this. They are literally scrubbing the top of the pre-existing continent. So it literally kind of erases some depth of soils and stuff like that right off the top of the continent. Now, the exact depth that it could is going to be totally dependent on the total kinetic energy, the amount of how fast the water's flowing, how thick the sediments are that are contained in the water, and so on and so forth. So it depends. Everyone's not going to be the same, not supposed to be. One of my big problems with evolutionists is their kind of hasty generalization of everything has to get the same result every time. It does not. So I'll stop right there since time's about out, and then we can start talking a little more, kind of get more into the actual physical mechanisms.
Okay, TRock, thank you for that response. Before we get into the open discussion, though, where you both can discuss all these points in detail, Grayson, you do have an uninterrupted response right now, too. So go ahead whenever you're ready.
Yeah, not sure if there's any evidence for any of what TRock just said, but even if we just take this model to be a fact, it still does not explain the fossil record. I'm sure we'll get there. I mean, so far we've only focused on the bottom layer, right? Or not even the bottom layer. We've only focused on the Cambrian, but okay. I hope that TRock is aware that there are places on Earth where the Cambrian is at the surface, right? So it's not like it's always real deep below the Earth. I mean, there are places where the Cambrian is at or very close to the surface. So again, this is because of differential rates of erosion. Different places have different rates of erosion, right? We can all agree on that. That's why, some places might have the Devonian near the surface. Some places might have Jurassic. Some places might have Cambrian because erosion rates are different. And, you can see when there's a difference between deposition and erosion dominant timeframes within the geologic record. So again, I really don't know what TRock is on about. But even his fanciful little model that doesn't have any evidence to support it still cannot explain what we see because, again, we have bottom-dwelling ocean animals at every single layer. They're not just in the Cambrian. We find them in the Mesozoic. We find them in the Cenozoic. Bottom-dwelling oceanic life at every layer. So his little fantasy about it scooping it up from the bottom and redistributing it on the top of the continents doesn't really make much sense. But also, just in terms of the continents moving much quicker than today, there's no evidence to support this. In fact, there's evidence demonstrating the exact opposite. When we look at the mid-Atlantic ridge and we see it spreading on the seafloor, that's kind of what's powering the movement of at least this tectonic plate in North America. At least one of the factors fueling it. And we can see that there's a paleomagnetic record in the rocks. Okay, so we can look at where the rocks were formed because they are aligned with the magnetic field of the Earth. And as it goes on, you can actually calculate at what speed this would have to be moving. And guess what? It's the exact same speed that we measure continents moving at today. So that would have to be, in TRock's model, a massive coincidence that is unexplained by any physical mechanism offered thus far. Again, why do our paleomagnetic observations from the Mid-Atlantic Ridge perfectly match the observed rate of movement of the continents today? They move at the same rate as we measure them have done in the past. So the fact that we get the same number using these two very different measurement methods has to be a complete coincidence for TRock, or else the continents were moving at the same rate in the past as they are today, which is what the evidence clearly shows. And TRock is asking, gesturing to plate tectonics is not specific enough. Okay, well, first of all, plate tectonics is a mechanism. Maybe if you understood it a little bit better, you would understand why I would bring it up as an explanation, because it is the explanation. So he says, why did it work on the West Coast and not the East Coast? Well, TRock, think about it. What does the West Coast have that the East Coast does not have? I'll give you a hint. A fault line. There's a border between two tectonic plates on the West Coast that is not on the East Coast, right? So there's more uplift that has occurred on the West Coast than there has on the East Coast. It's not hard to figure out. So again, there are mechanisms to explain what he's bringing up, and what he's bringing up is either just a story of how he thinks that maybe this stuff could have gone down, but even his own fantasy does not explain the fossil record in reality. So that's why I guess I'm sure that we will get more into his proposed mechanism. This seemed like just an intro to it to explain the Cambrian. I'm sure we'll get more into it, but I'm really, really interested in how he can explain the fossil record. So hopefully we will hear that tonight.
You said I did not do anything to explain the fossil order. I specifically explained why the Cambrian is below the Pliocene. That's why it's below, because it's at the bottom of the sea and it gets scooped up. So it's necessarily going to be under all the other layers above it. It has to be at that point. So I've already given a very sound mechanistic method of getting the Cambrian below 90% of the geological column. So go ahead and tell me your thoughts on that.
Well, you kind of touched on this when you brought it up in the first place, but there are layers, fossil-bearing layers below the Cambrian, the Ediacaran, but even below that, we have fossils of single-celled organisms going way deeper than that. So I fail to see how starting at the Cambrian in this flood model solves anything, because you still have to explain the fossils below the Cambrian.
I mean, it's a fair point, but you kind of tacitly admitted that I did give a reason for the Cambrian being below a whole bunch of other layers. Now, you want the rest of it. It's going to take a little while to flesh it all out, so you got to be patient.
Okay, well, I will just start, and then you can get into the explanation of the other layers. But explaining one layer does not explain the order, because order implies more than one layer. So you explaining why one layer exists in your model does not explain anything about the order. So I want to hear the other layers in relation to the Cambrian and how they stack up. So that's
okay. So I'm gonna have to back up just a second, because one of the other aspects of the fossil record that you described earlier, and you said, I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that you made the comment earlier, it may have been with Professor McQueen, but you made the comment earlier that ecological zonation doesn't explain certain aspects. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. However, would you be willing to acknowledge that the evolutionary paradigm has a strong sense of ecological zonation in the fossil record?
Yeah. But let me just clarify what I mean by that. Fossils generally form with other fossils that lived in the same habitat that it did. So when we find a fossilized forest, you're going to find the species that made up that forest when it was alive.
Sure.
When you find fossils in a certain area from the Jurassic, you might be finding all of the types of Jurassic animals that were living in that exact geological location. So there is, like, I don't know if you want to call it ecological zonation or whatever, that exists, but it is incapable of explaining the order between the different layers. That was my point with it.
Sure. I would hesitate. I mean, seriously, I would hesitate saying things like it's incapable, inadequate, because we've barely even started the conversation. There's a lot of mechanisms to talk about here, a lot of physics mechanisms. So I'm starting with the Cambrian again. I started with it solely for the sake of familiarity. Everybody's familiar with the Cambrian, what it is and what its relationship is to like all the other layers that include mammoths and dinosaurs and whatever, right? That's the reason I can't say it all in 3 minutes. So with that, got to back up again to explain what we see today versus what we see in the fossil record. Today, crabs, crustaceans, stuff like that live in the bottom of the ocean. Plants, broadleaf plants, and vertebrate animals, stuff like that live up on top of the land, right? So they're already separated ecologically in that sense and by elevation relative to sea level. there's a specific reason for that, and that is design. It's designed, everything's designed to be in its location for a specific function that it does. And the only reason, and I'm not going to go real deep into that, I just want to kind of lay the foundation down here for describing that when you talk about how do you explain the Eddicarian, or however it's pronounced, and the Archean and that sort of thing. It's because in the seafloor, or in the sea in general, and the same thing is true on land, at the surface, you have one type of animal. When you go deeper, there's a different type. When you go deeper, there's a different type. That's true in real life today, both on land and on sea. And so Cambrian, sorry, I need to close my email. It's giving me too many bizarre notifications. So anyway, the bottom of the ocean should necessarily have creatures that can live at deeper depths, should have creatures that can burrow deeper than others, that sort of thing. And so whenever this mechanism that I'm describing about the continent sliding across the ocean floor, it's basically what I think. And what you're hearing is probably going to be real new, even to a lot of creationists, because even the creationists don't typically talk in this type of specific detail. But I think probably what's happened here is the seafloor, if the seafloor is here and the continent's here, the seafloor, as the continent moves towards it, the seafloor is actually buckling, is kind of buckling down. But what that's going to do is at some point, the continent is still kind of scooping out in front of it. And it's actually digging quite deep towards the seafloor because it's in kind of a downhill sliding motion. So necessarily, if the seafloor is here and the continent's here, really what's happening is it's doing like that and kind of bowing into it and forcing the seafloor, what can be removed from it, forcing it to come up over the top of the continent. So I'll stop there and let you kind of think about that for a second.
So are you saying that the layers below the Cambrian were all like underground? While it's all scooped up?
I'm saying that what you call the Eddicarian, for example, and there's a term out there, you can tell me if you've heard this. We talk about the Cambrian explosion. I think there's a term out there in the evolutionary camp called the Eddicarian explosion, right?
Okay.
It's kind of a subjective idea. It's somebody's descriptive way of trying to kind of make sense of what they see. But the point is, in the Eddicarian that's below the Cambrian, it's got a significant amount of what we would recognize as fully formed life forms. My point being that those are the types of life forms that necessarily are the deeper burrowers in the seafloor than what you see at the Cambrian level, which is a little higher in the seafloor.
Okay, well then you are mistaken, because in the Ediacaran we have certain types of animals found that had to be right there at the like they had to be in the water. They couldn't be underground. They couldn't have burrowed. They were filter feeders. They had to be in the ocean. They had to be at that. They're benthic organisms. They're at the bottom of the ocean on that same layer that you're saying that the Cambrian is from. So they occupy the same habitat.
So I mean, I can appreciate, I hope you do too. I can appreciate the fact that I'm not a biologist and understand that. But a lot of burrowers are burrowers because they can transition from the water to the depths in the sediments.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, yeah, if that were true, then we would find them in both the Ediacaran and the Cambrian, but we only find them in the Ediacaran, not the Cambrian.
Well, we'll get to that. I'm going to get to that aspect too. That's kind of a different aspect, okay. And that absolutely merits its own explanation.
And I'll just one last thing, these benthic organisms that live at the bottom of the ocean are not just found in the Cambrian. They're found in every single layer, right? So this is an example where they're occupying the same habitat, the same ecological zonation, but you can find them all the way up there with the mammals in the Cenozoic. You can find them all the way with the dinosaurs in the Mesozoic, and you can find them all the way in the Cambrian. You find them in every layer. There's benthic organisms in every geological layer.
Okay, so I'm going to use an example I'm a little more familiar with because I'm not real educated at all on marine life, and I'll freely acknowledge that. But when I talk about burrowers, for example, on land, we can talk about in a very similar fashion. We can talk about the burrowers on land, like Wasps are burrowers, right? Termites, beetles, worms, grubs. There's a whole host of animals that are burrowers. Now, if you think about something like grubs, they can come up onto the surface of the ground where you can see them visibly, but generally speaking, they stay underground. But if you compare that to something like a beetle, a lot of beetles can burrow into the ground, but when they come out, a lot of them can fly too, and they can be found in the trees. So beetles have a very broad range of environments in which they can operate, right?
Yeah.
So
that's what makes it even more like strong evidence against your position that you only find like this. They're segregated out by species. So like a certain kind of beetle is only going to be found in certain numbers of layers, right? Like it's not like all of a sudden we find the grubs in one layer and we find the adult flying beetles in a higher layer. That's what your model would be predicting, but that's not what we find in reality.
okay, so we're not done fleshing out the mechanisms, right? So, I mean, like again, I would be a little careful about trying to be too resolute about this whole you can't explain. There are very good explanations. So there's another aspect of the mechanism. So I'm describing the physical mechanisms that you can actually test. You can, what I described as a hydrofoil, where you've got the fluid flowing up over the surface, just like you would think of how air flows over the top of an airplane wing. You can actually test these concepts and see if fluid flows in that manner, and indeed it does. It's well established, true empirical science. So that brings me to another aspect of the fossil record and how you talk about ecological zonation. So there are certain types of animals. For example, I'll use rabbits. There are white rabbits way up north, right, in the Arctic. They typically have white fur, sometimes a little gray tuft on them, whatever, but they're typically very white up north in the Arctic zones. Come down south, and they're not so white anymore, right? They tend to be browns, grays, patchy, that sort of thing. Rabbits live all over the planet, but the white rabbits don't naturally inhabit the same ecological zone that the brown rabbits do. They're in two different places. Mm-hmm. So if you pick up and keep in mind here, this one very extremely important aspect of the fossil record that is typically just kind of hand waved away is the fact that you have marine sediments, things like belemnids, gastropods, a whole host of marine creatures that are found with land animals. Now, I think it should go without saying that dinosaurs and rabbits and mammoths don't live in marine sediments. So one of the big points to make here is that what you see in the fossil record is not where any one of those organisms actually lived. It lived somewhere else, right? It was transported to that location. So even if you're talking about an entire eco habitat here that gets transported together so that all of it, like in where I live, we've got rabbits, coyotes, deer, beetles, squirrels, all this in this one area. If the whole thing moves them all together and deposits them here, they did not live over here. They lived over here somewhere else. You can't really, I'll say it this way, it would be extremely difficult to actually identify geographically where this eco habitat, where did it actually live and operate in its living form? It would be really difficult to figure that out looking at the fossil record.
So I don't understand how you can say what you just said and still advocate for ecological zonation, because you're saying that these fossils are formed like with the other species in the habitat that they lived in. But then you're saying that the entire habitat was moved and transported by the flood without mixing with all the other habitats.
So, yeah, that's a great question, Grayson. Apologize, I have a message here I need to respond to. That's a great question. That's brought up quite a bit, and I've heard some form of this argument extensively. It's super, super common. However, talk about mixing. And I've talked about this in some of my previous conversations and debates and stuff, but rarely do we ever take this time to try and put it all together. But whatever your sense of mixing on a global scale is quite apparently from all the conversation that I've ever heard is woefully inadequate to describe what should the mixing expectation be on a global scale. Is very different than what it should be on a local scale. And so specifically when I'm suggesting it, which I know what the mechanism is, why that should be, water is incompressible. For all intent and purpose, it's incompressible. So if you pick up an entire ecological zone and move it, the water that it's being transported in is incompressible. There's no effective way to rapidly mix this ecological zone way over here with this one when the whole thing is moving like this. The only way to do that is if you have some sort of very high end, like a hurricane, that is on a very large scale is mixing it like a blender in a bowl of cake mix kind of thing. That's not what you would expect on a global scale. You have to have water flowing in large portions, not globally entirely all at one time, the entire thing moving in one direction. That's not it either. You have to have large swaths of bodies of water moving like this that can't compress, and they're not doing the hurricane thing. That's the only way you could get the mixing that you're implying you should see.
So why do actual floods cause this mixing to occur? Like real floods that are observable, that go through multiple ecological zones, do mix the stuff from all the different zones. This actually does happen with real floods.
That's a fair question, but I literally just answered that. The scale matters. In a local flood, let's say you live in the valley area between two mountains. If a local flood comes through there, you've got the boundaries are trapping the water in such a way that they're in close enough proximity that zone, and it's still just that zone. It's not mixing that zone with something way down, miles and miles away. You've got the boundaries of the water flow so close together that it has the opportunity to mix more like a blender in a cake, in a bowl of cake mix.
Okay. I mean, I'm just saying that normal water in real life, the way that water works and flows is that you don't just have this one mass of water moving all by itself, right? There's going to be interference. The waves are going to be coming from multiple directions, and they're going to be causing mixing. This is why in real floods, mixing does occur. So, I mean, I literally, this is just, I cannot even picture what it is you're trying to describe where you think that, like, in instances where we have one location, right, just one site, and we see multiple ecological zones at different vertical layers, right?
Yep.
At the different layers, there might be marine layers, there might be desert layers, there might be forest layers, all in the same location. So for that to happen, right, there would either have to be, I don't know, multiple waves of flood, and the first wave brings in all the bottom of the ocean, which is what you're saying, how the Cambrian formed. And then all those layers have to get, like, the Cambrian layer has to get deposited, and it has to then, lithify. And then a new layer has to come in and bring in the desert ecology and layer. And then another layer, another flood has to, like, wave has to come and deposit the next layer of marine, and then another one has to come and deposit all the forest. Is that what you're saying happened all over the earth in a way that never had any mixing of any of these layers?
To be sure, I'm rarely ever saying what the evolutionists think I'm saying. But let's back up for just a second. You went back to the local flood dynamic and tried to make a direct comparison with the global flood dynamic. And I think it goes without saying, you cannot replicate a global flood. You can't do it. You can replicate on a small scale a local flood, but it's impossible to replicate a global flood for very obvious reasons, right? Can you at least acknowledge that much?
I truthfully do not know why, like what your explanation is, why flood dynamics would change with like a regional versus
I
a
told you
global scale.
why. In the open ocean, you can have a 10-mile swath, a 10-mile wide swath of water moving. You're not going to have that in most local floods. By definition, they're local floods. So
Yes, you're saying that the size is different, but I'm asking why are the dynamics different?
the dynamics are not different. They're the same. You're making a false equivocation between how localized boundaries of fluid flow should behave versus global. The scale is bigger. So what you're looking for is this mixing zone. You're looking for a zone where if I've got a very wide sheet of water moving this way and a different one moving this way, there is a mixing zone, just like on a local scale. It's not different in that regard. The difference is how big is that mixing? How long does it take to actually homogenize any given cubic volumetric representation of that? There's a lot of differences in that. And it's specifically because of the scale. If you can't separate the difference in scales, you're never going to understand the conversation anyway. It's a physics problem. It is not a biological problem.
Yeah, so if the dynamics are the same regardless of scale, then we would not expect to see nice, neat, ordered layers. We would expect to see all this stuff mixed up. That's what happens on a local scale because of the dynamics. And if the dynamics are the same on a global scale, that's what we would expect on a global scale, but that's not what we see in real life. So maybe we should move on to how you're explaining the fossil record. That's what we're trying to do.
I'll get to a bigger, wider overview for your sake, because one of the things that I keep noticing is you keep jumping. I told you, this is a long conversation because of the total mechanisms. The other major important part is what exactly did the biodome look like in the pre-flood continent, in the pre-flood world? How was it physically arranged? That absolutely matters. And so if you jump past the mechanisms and draw your conclusions before you even know these details, you're never going to understand this. You have to slow down and actually pick up all the relevant details. And it's going to take us, it will take us a while with two of us going back and forth to actually flesh that all out. I hope that you can appreciate that aspect of this whole conversation.
Look, in real floods, when we see the aftermath for real floods, things are not neatly ordered according to ecological zonation, like what you're talking about. They're not sorted based on habitat. They're all mixed up in a real flood. So I don't know how you get a flood that perfectly orders the fossil record into distinct layers, sorting by species. Water is not capable of doing that. So you need something else.
Not true, Grayson. Again, you keep jumping to the conclusion before you even understand the mechanism.
Well, I'm trying to get you to address that point, right? You keep saying that's the conclusion.
That's
the point I'm trying to get you to address.
I am getting there, but you keep kind of interrupting the flow of the conversation by demanding that it can't do this, it can't do that. I haven't even gotten to all of the initial conditions and all the physics involved in this. So how can you jump to the end of the conversation that quick?
Just explain how water can do it. Just
Okay.
explain how it worked, how it happened then.
Again, this is the big point that you seem to miss. Water is not the only dynamic under consideration. There is also the physical configuration of the continents themselves, the ocean floor, the biota, both on top and below. Everything matters. You can't separate any of it out and say, oh, water can't do this, or plate tectonics can't do that, or you can't do that. You have to get the entire picture.
So you're saying that water can, like a flood, can reproduce the fossil record we see if a certain initial conditions are met. Is that what your argument is?
Yes.
Okay, so what are the initial conditions that would create the fossil record during a global flood?
That's a really good question. Okay. I think we all hold in common that at some point in the past, there was one so-called supercontinent, right?
There were multiple, but okay.
At least at one point in time, there was one supercontinent, right?
Sure.
Okay. We both hold in common that generally speaking, the ocean occupies about 2/3 of the Earth's surface, and the land occupies about 1/3 of the Earth's surface, right?
If you say so.
Okay.
Go on.
Now, pre-flood, what was the average height above sea level on the continent?
No idea.
Exactly. I don't either, except we can make a few simple deductions and kind of make an educated guess about it. My educated guess is, and when I say flood, keep in mind, I understand that I'm the one advocating for a global flood, but I also well understand, because me and you went through this exercise the other day, that the evolutionary history also has some massive flooding where the continents currently are, right? So what I'm saying here is that part of the pre-flood conditions look to me like the average height above sea level would have been much lower than what our max mountain range heights are now, much lower. Our average today is much lower than the max mountain range heights are, obviously. But I guess what I'm saying is today's average height above sea level is higher now than what it was pre-flood, in my estimation. And I'm willing to be proven wrong on that in some way, or somebody make at least a compelling argument to think that may not be the case. But I think that probably was the case. I think generally speaking, what we probably somewhat deduced from the fossil record is that the pre-flood world had a lower average height above sea level, and that a large part of the coastal region around the supercontinent was low grasslands, specifically where dinosaurs might have inhabited the lower grasslands. Large dinosaurs, very large dinosaurs, just don't look like mountain climbers to me. So whatever mountains did exist, I wouldn't expect very large sauropods to be living on those mountains. I would also not expect very large sauropods to be walking through most forest areas. Now, would make an obvious exception if your forests look like the California redwoods, where you've got a lot of space for them to move. But I would not generally expect very large dinosaurs to be walking through the pine trees in Arkansas, for example. They're too close together. It's not their habitat anyway. What I would expect is that they should live near large bodies of water, right? So
can I address a little bit of that?
Sure. Yeah.
Just from the consensus view, dinosaurs predate grass. Grass is not a very ancient type of plant. There's no grass fossils from most of the layers of the fossil record. It's relatively new to the scene. So grasslands are a newer type of habitat that didn't really exist at the dinosaur era. That dinosaurs were able to traverse forests because they interact in an ecological interaction sense with the forest. They're stomping down all the smaller plants, and the forests of that day were much more open and much less densely there's a lot less dense undergrowth in the forest. You have a lot of gymnosperms, which David brought up earlier, and you didn't have a lot of angiosperms like during the Jurassic. But the forests looked different than today. The forests were much more wide and open for dinosaurs to be moving around. And when we look at the Jurassic layer, that's what we see. We don't see any angiosperms. We see a bunch of gymnosperm trees, and we see what plants are found in the Jurassic forests, and we can see what kind of forests they are, and they don't resemble the kinds of forests that you're describing. But that's just the consensus view from the Jurassic era. I know you're going through your model here, so you want to say, okay, there are a bunch of grasslands and dense forests or whatever along the coast of this supercontinent. Okay.
Okay, Grayson, I'll take a direct objection to some of what you just said. You said dinosaurs predate grass.
Yeah.
No, no, the open literature doesn't actually lay it out quite like that. That's a little bit too broad. At the very least, it's a little too broad. Grass has been found in the stomachs of dinosaurs. They ate grass. Some of them, at least.
In the late Cretaceous. Grass is evolved in the late Cretaceous period. So in the Jurassic and Triassic, they don't find any grasses in the fossil record.
Okay, well, I understand that may be your particular model. Whether
It's not a model, that's a fact. We in layers
that's not
that are the Jurassic and Triassic. I challenge you, find me a grass fossil in the Jurassic layer. Find
Grayson, the whole point of this conversation is to explain the order of grass in the fossil record.
Yeah. Okay. So you're gonna explain the order of grass. I gotcha. We can go on. I'm sorry to derail your explanation of your model. We can go on.
No, it's fine. I mean, I welcome your input, but I mean, again, you can't keep jumping to your conclusion before you've even. It's going to take a while to lay this out.
Okay. So I hope that your explanation can explain why there are no grasses found below the Cretaceous layers. I just hope that that's a part of your explanation.
Okay. So I'm trying to set the stage here, though, for the configuration of the continents specifically as I kind of perceive them. And again, some of this is very difficult to deduce from the fossil record. So I'm more than willing to have conversations with intelligent people that are actually doing this from more of a mechanistic forensics viewpoint than they are, just jumping up and say, oh, well, why don't you see angiosperms here? And why don't you see rabbits with you're not talking about the mechanisms, and the mechanisms are the only thing that can account for the order. Period.
What you're describing there is the outcomes that the mechanisms would have to produce.
Yep.
So yeah, I think that the outcomes that the mechanisms have to explain are relevant for a discussion of the mechanisms. But okay,
I agree.
Model. I
agree. You're right. They are relevant, but one dictates the other, not the other way around. and part of the point in saying that is that any given mechanism can produce more than one result. Kind of
the outcome, as in the fossil record, puts constraints on what kind of mechanisms are physically plausible to produce that outcome.
In a sense, I will accept that. In a sense, I'll accept that, so we can just move on.
Okay.
So back to the pre-flood configuration. If you're not familiar very specifically, and I mean very specifically, and my experience is that the critics are almost never familiar very specifically with the biblical model, you're going to get lost real quick and make a whole bunch of wild assumptions that are just probably not true. And I can't lay out every single detail in this conversation because that alone would take a long time, but I'm going to generalize it a little bit, and we can go back and kind of rehash some of this if we need to. But the flood starts with the fountains of the Great Deep breaking up and 40 days of initial rain. Those two factors are extremely important. Fountains of the Great Deep. Now, there are some varying opinions out there, but fountains of the deep in the very plainly understood reading of the text refers to water coming up out of the ocean floor. Water, not has no direct reference to volcanism or magmas coming up or anything like that. It is specific to water by a very simple plain reading of the text. Okay, rain. This to me is probably the more important part, just because what people like you tend to want to do is say, why aren't there rabbits in the Cambrian? And so this 40 days of rain has direct relevance to that. 40 days of rain. Again, I'm not a biologist, and I'm not trying to make some grand sweeping statement. And so I really hope that people don't try and say things that I didn't say or make inferences that I'm not trying to make. Just take it in a simple sense for now. 40 days of rain. What happens with the local biota on land during heavy rainfall?
They seek shelter.
Thank you. They seek shelter. So if we go take a look I have a slide. I don't know that I necessarily need to show it, but I've got one here that's got a list of animals. Okay, we're up. I've got a slide here. It's got a list of animals that are actually found alongside dinosaurs. They seek shelter. Absolutely. That's the first thing I would expect anybody to say. Squirrels, for example, the very first animal on the list. Where do they normally live?
In forested areas with trees.
Very good. And I'm saying that I would not expect large dinosaurs to live in forested areas in my worldview. I understand your argument about when grasses evolved and when angiosperms evolved and all that stuff. But here's the thing. If that squirrel exists, angiosperms existed. Period.
I think that you're making a little bit of an assumption that it's a modern looking squirrel. I think that there would be numerous.
That's funny, Grayson. The funny thing about digging up fossils is you can readily recognize. I mean, we don't need to get off on a tangent about stasis here for sure, but you can readily recognize what a lot of these skeletons are. That's why they're busted up, they're disarticulated, and you can still readily recognize what a lot of them are.
Right, but
so my assumption is not as far-fetched as what you're implying.
I think that maybe a 5-year-old would get confused thinking that they look similar to squirrels. But when you do a closer examination, when you actually have knowledge of the bones of modern squirrels, I think you would see that an expert would be able to see that there are numerous differences. It's like a game of was it like the 20 differences where you're looking at two images that at first might look similar, and then you look closer and you see all these differences. All right, these are not modern squirrels in any of these Mesozoic layers. Squirrels did not exist in the Mesozoic layers. So already now possums, your second example, there you go. I will grant you that that again, they're not modern looking possums, but they look very, very similar to modern looking possums. There are differences though, and you can't just sweep those under the rug. You have to acknowledge the differences, but they look superficially very similar to modern possums. And there's a complete explanation for that in evolution. In fact, the newest video on my channel even mentions possums specifically as their biological niche that possums occupy has not changed very greatly. That's why if your niche, your role in the ecological environment that you're fulfilling, if that doesn't change, then you don't need to change either. The only reason that animals would need to evolve is if they either need to evolve to be more successful at their niche, or if the conditions of their niche have changed. So that's a reason why you would have differences. Otherwise, you would just have selection for the same kind of body plans that were successful in that niche to begin with. That's why possums look very similar, because their niche hasn't changed much. 11 minutes left. I'd really like you to get to an explanation for the fossil record.
So again, I can't explain the entire thing in this short of a conversation with back and forth conversation, and I don't want to rob you of your time to have input either. But I'm trying to paint the picture here that this concept of order is not what you think it is, and you have to understand where everything was when the flood was going. So back up to what I was talking about. What do animals do during the first 40 days of rain? So I'll try and breeze through kind of a bigger overview real quick so you can come back and have some more input. 40 days of rain. Everything tends to sort itself into its shelter habitat, right?
Okay.
So an example I'm very familiar with is deer. Deer in the South tend to go into the thickets. So they're in the woods because most of the thickets are in the woods, but they can be kind of out on the outskirts of the woods too, because thickets grow in a number of places, but they typically go into the thickets. So if you're a hunter and you're walking through a wooded area or a place where there's a lot of heavy brush that a person could not walk through, but you're walking past it, it's real easy to scare a deer up that you had no idea was there, because that's how they bed down at night on a daily basis. But during rain time, they do this because most mammals want to be out of the rain as much as they possibly can. Now, that's different than something like a possum who can be a burrower, right? Possums can burrow. So anyway, the point is every animal finds where it's naturally going to go. And animals also have an incredible instinct whenever the cloud cover starts getting dark, for instance, they already know it's time to head home before the rain actually starts. So do they get caught in the rain? Of course they do. Some of them actually hang out in the rain as long as it's not too intense, but we're talking about a very intense rainfall. So the animals have kind of sorted themselves up front from the beginning. Now, would you agree that that is a reasonable way to begin a sorting process?
I don't even know to agree or disagree at this point. I just want you to get to the explanation.
Okay, fair enough. But you're the one that's having me go this without your input. So that's where the sorting begins, is with the rain. Now, interestingly, fish actually do something very similar to this. And again, I'm not a biologist. I'm not trying to make this broad stroke claim of anything in particular, but I do know that fish, for example, they do something very similar to that. So as a fisherman, and I like to fish, I'm not a fisherman, but I do like to fish. I did a lot of it when I was young, but you go out to fish, and what you find is that at certain times of day and during certain weather patterns, the fish they'll be tucked up in the weeds. They'll be up in the catfish, for example, go up into the mud banks and kind of waller their way and burrow their way into the mud bank below the water line and do that sort of thing. So in that vein, in a heavy rain, I would expect the catfish, for example, to go burrow up into the mud in the river, as opposed to just being out free-form feeding, because they only do that. They do it cyclically through the day, but only, I think, a couple times a day. But anyway, so I expect some sort of sorting to happen in the water as well as on the land. And so the vast majority of the marine biota, so this has been pointed out in past conversations, they live kind of close to the shoreline. But nonetheless, they still do the same thing. They look for cover in as much as they can find it, and how they normally do it during their day in and day out life, right? Okay. So in a very broad sense, that's where the sorting begins. Where it continues from there is during this 40 days of heavy rain, what you would expect to find is, because it's 40 days, because it's very intense, and because the animals have very little feeding opportunity during an extended period of heavy rain, I'm expecting that a whole bunch of these animals have died within the first 40 days. And I mean a large percentage of them, not small. So water flows downhill, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anything closer to the coastline should be swept out into the ocean open first, right? We're still sorting.
Okay, if you're sweeping out things to the sea, then the things near the coastline should be swept out to sea first. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
So we've already got an additional sorting mechanism, right? Now, whatever the average land animal average land animals can actually swim, right? You would agree with that?
Sure.
And to be clear, because I know you wouldn't necessarily know if I didn't just tell you this, I do not ascribe to any of the swimmer hypotheses to explain sorting. I don't ascribe to any of those, and I don't ascribe to the intelligence sorting. None of that. I'm talking strictly, what does any given life form do under specific circumstances?
Okay.
So mammals can swim. Deer can swim. I think cows can. I'm not sure, but I think cows can. I know deer can. I know probably squirrels can swim. I don't know how well, but I'm imagining they probably can. Anyway, a whole bunch of land animals can swim. But the problem is, during a global flood, you've gone 40 days with very limited feeding opportunity. Your energy is really low. You're swept out into moving water, and your ability to swim to rescue yourself is extremely limited at this point. And it's only compounded by the fact that you might have floating debris knocking you around in the moving water as well. So again, more sorting mechanisms. But the point here is that anything close to the coastline that gets swept out to sea first, if it was alive, it dies first. And so now you've got these dead animals out in the open ocean very early in the flood. And so what I would expect to happen is that these animals that have died very early are going to start disintegrating and decaying ahead of anything that's at a higher elevation, right? I think that's a reasonable expectation.
Okay.
You die first, you start decaying first. Basic rule of biology, right?
Okay.
So again, this is going to turn into another sorting mechanism. If a land animal, I'm speaking in the context of land vertebrates specifically for the sake of familiarity, nothing else. We can get into more specifics later. If a land animal gets swept out to sea, he's already dead or dies very shortly after he gets swept out to sea, and he starts the decaying process. He's also going to start the sinking process first. Right?
Sure.
And as I pointed out in our previous debate, salt water has a tendency of accelerating the decay. That was that forensics paper that I shared. That's what they do in modern forensics when you're doing criminal investigation. So now you've got those that got swept into the ocean decaying at a faster rate initially. They'll get caught up with, because again, anything that's at a higher elevation probably died during the first 40 days, and not everything. There's survivors. There's plenty of opportunities for survivors. But part of the point, though, is that the difference in time between the first 40 days and, say, the next 3 months or whatever, modern geological methods have zero way of delineating timelines that are that close together. There's no way to do it. They don't talk in terms like that. They talk in terms of deep geological time at say, plus or minus 2% of whatever the proposed era was, whatever. So whenever you have them happen this close together, there's no way to distinguish geologically what the difference is in terms of its timeline. But we're talking about sorting, right? So what I'm expecting to happen out of this sorting, is an additional sorting method where the bones of the dinosaur, for example, that I'm suggesting is a coastal dweller, he's out in the middle of the ocean, he's dead, he's deteriorating, he's sinking to the bottom. The salt in the ocean is accelerating his decay. And lo and behold, when we find them, we typically find them very disarticulated. So it does not take very long for an animal to become disarticulated in moving water. That was one of the other points made in our previous debate with the forensics paper. They become disarticulated very rapidly. So we find a lot of disarticulation in the fossil record, but it's not unique to the dinosaur era. The other geological eras that follow that by tens of millions of years have the same exact dynamic, right?
So, okay. Are you saying that Permian animals lived farther inland than Mesozoic? No, you would be saying that Permian animals lived closer to the coast than dinosaurs, who lived closer to the coast than all mammals.
Basically something similar to how you see the various forms of animal life live today. Yes, there are definitely species that are very much coastal dwellers, and there are species that are very much intercontinent, inside the middle of the landform, altitude variations, whatever, but they are in distinctly different ecosystems today. And again, the evolutionist has a very strong sense of ecological zonation in the fossil records. So that shouldn't be a difference between us.
Yeah, I mean, typically fossils are found in the environment, like with the other species that they lived in the same environment with. True, but that doesn't mean that ecological zonation is a sorting mechanism to explain the layers in a vertical sense. to explain, the Jurassic layers versus the Cambrian versus these things are not ecologically sorted vertically into layers. They're only ecologically sorted in a geographic sense, not in a vertical layered sense.
I think I'll take issue with that statement too, because I think you're being a little too general when you say such a thing. And so when you say vertical, somebody out there is probably getting the impression that the mammoth is above the dinosaur. In reality, that's not true at all in most cases. In most cases, what may actually be true, and is actually demonstrably true, is the dinosaur is way over here, up here at this height, and the mammoth is way over here, down here at this height. So vertically, the mammoth is not above the dinosaur, it's well below it.
But whenever you dig below the mammoth, you start finding dinosaurs.
Maybe, or maybe not. You might find a giant unconformity of supposed missing geological time.
Yeah, but generally, right, you're gonna start finding the earlier layers. It might skip a layer or two, but you're gonna find if all of the Mesozoic layers are washed away, you're gonna find Paleozoic layers. You're not gonna find more Cenozoic layers.
I understand, and I already made this comment earlier. I'm not even taking an issue, generally speaking, that there is an order, and I distinctly am going to say a general order, not an absolute order, because the whole thing about what order is very subjective in the first place.
Yeah. So at least, unlike David, TRock attempted to explain the fossil record. He attempted to. I mean, maybe there was more he wanted to talk about. I let him talk for a long, long time to try to get an answer for a possible mechanism. So what I heard was that the continents moved really fast, and all the water swept up the ocean floor and deposited the first layer, and then the layers beyond that, after the floodwaters have already swept up the ocean floor onto the surface. After that, then all of the deluge from the first 40 days of the flood then washed all from the continent and washed everything on the surface to the sea. So already those two ideas are in fundamental conflict with each other. Either the rains happened first and washed everything out to sea, or the seawaters were transported onto the surface and deposited the first Cambrian layers. You can't really have both of those occurring at once in the same model. They don't really fit together. So since the Cambrian is at the bottom, I mean, then we could go with that. But even his explanation for the seawater or the rainwater washing everything out to sea also doesn't work, because, for example, we find things that like flying mammals in the Jurassic that are totally different, not at all related to bats or sugar gliders, and yet those things would all exist in the same habitat. I mean, they exist. They eat insects. They live in trees. They fly. They glide around. They're mammals. How would them washing away that doesn't work? I mean, they wouldn't exist. For some reason, they would only exist farther inland than the other ones. I mean, none of this is making any sense. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it makes sense in TRock's brain, but I'm trying to wrap my head around this model that he's proposing, and it still doesn't explain the fossil record that we observe. Now, if TRock says that he admits that there's a general order for the fossil record, so I don't understand why we wasted all that time in the debate talking about squirrels in the Jurassic or whatever, if he admits that there is an order. So that all seemed like a wasted amount of time in the debate. But I mean, so I don't think that his model can adequately describe the fossil record as we see. I mean, you have something like hippos and dicynodonts would be existing in the same habitat. Both of them are semi-aquatic. They would be around like the same areas that a hippo would live, a dicynodont would live. like the semi-aquatic varieties, at least there's more arid varieties of dicynodonts as well. So again, and the deserts totally throw out his entire model as well if we just look at desert species. So we find numerous examples of species that would be existing in the same habitat that are segregated by the geological layers. So again, I didn't hear any explanation for that. I especially didn't hear any explanation for the plankton question, which, I mean, how do you possibly explain that with this whole model of the rain waters for 40 days and this sweeping up onto the continents? I mean, I don't see how that could possibly sort plankton according to distinct layers by species. Again, you find plankton in most of the layers. You find bottom dwelling marine life in every layer. So none of this tracks with what we actually see in reality and anything that TRock has explained. And previously, I just wanted to mention real quick, he didn't bring up the mega sequences. I see people in chat bringing up mega sequences. He brought up mega sequences in my discussion with TRock from the other day, these like 5 mega sequences. And I just need to clarify, if I ever interact with TRock in the future, I guess, because it didn't come up here, but those mega sequences are specific to North America. No geologist has successfully described any global mega sequences. The mega sequences that he lists, like the sock, the Tippecanoe, those are only applicable to North America. They are not global. So again, they disprove this whole notion of a global flood. If a global flood occurred, we would expect to see very apparent global mega sequences, but we don't. There is no successful geologist that has described any global mega sequences. The only mega sequences are specific to each continent because each continent has its own unique geological history. There was an inland sea in the middle of North America, which caused different mega sequences to occur because there were differences in erosions and deposition rates as a result of where that sea level was at in North America. But the North American mega sequences are not applicable on a global level, and no geologist has successfully been able to describe any global mega sequences, which we would expect to be very, very obvious if a global flood really did occur. But again, the topic was, how does a global flood create the fossil record we observe? I think that McQueen just completely did not answer that. TRock has sort of attempted to lay out a model. It's just that his model is insufficient. So I'll let him respond and then we can get to some Q&A.
Grayson, thank you very much for that concluding summary, just about 6 minutes. So I appreciate it. What we'll do, TRock, will give you equal time, which means we have exactly 5 to 6 minutes before we jump into the audience Q&A. I do have several excellent questions saved. I think we'll have some fun. And that means the audience has about 6 minutes to send in questions. And then I'll shut it down for the night questions-wise. So TRock, whenever you're ready, I'll restart the timer. You've got 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Donnie. Feel free to stop me if I go long. Do you mind putting me back on the 3-panel deal?
Sure,
I think
yeah.
it's helpful to me. Well, Grayson ducked out. Grayson, are you still listening?
Yeah, I'm still listening.
Okay, thank you. A visual from you might be helpful in just a second. But what I want to say is, personally, I totally appreciate the difference in educational background between myself and Grayson's background. Grayson, as I understand it, your educational background is microbiology. Am I saying that correct?
Biochemistry.
Biochemistry. Okay, thank you. So biochemistry, and that's great. And so in the biblical model period, in a much broader sense than Origins, every man operates according to the gifts that he's given. And so Grayson is operating under his particular aptitude and interest of biochemistry, right? So my background's very different. So what I'm saying is, Grayson, I do not feel like I'm on equal footing with you when it comes to biochemistry. I believe you're leaps and bounds ahead of me in that field. However, I'm leaps and bounds ahead of you when it comes to applied physics. And the reason is because I work in a mechanical engineering / manufacturing capacity. And so what I know is that I am very well practiced in cause and effect of physically moving bodies, like Newtonian physics. And so specifically what I do is in the manufacturing aspect, what I'm doing is I'm taking an engineer's design on paper, and this is one aspect of it, but I look at his design on paper and I project what mechanism will make his design. And by vice versa, I take the actual finished part, and I may have some decent examples here. But I take a finished part of whatever nature it is, and I look at it, and I can also look at that and tell you how it was made. And I can tell you multiple ways that it's made. I can tell you multiple paths to get to the same thing. So my whole strength here is that I understand very well cause and effect, and you and I are not on equal footing in this regard. But Newtonian physics is exactly how the fossils got where they got. So when I hear you talk about the mechanisms and how this can't do that and that can't do that, I'm sorry, but I'm just like, Grayson, I understand physical mechanisms, and I understand this concept that I was describing early, configurations. It matters where things are and when they're there. A whole bunch of the physical properties about them matter. So I don't expect Grayson to understand the physics of anything that I'm describing. What I expect Grayson to do is just kind of say, well, the fossil doesn't explain that. The fossil can't explain it no matter how hard it tries, because it was dead when it got there. The living animals couldn't swim fast enough, and the dead ones sure can't do it. So I find it's just extremely interesting to me when I have these conversations with people who don't do what I do and don't actually put mechanisms together to produce an intended result. I think it's really disingenuous to pretend you already know the answer before you even understand the mechanisms that are even possible. It's like you jump right past what are the possible mechanisms, what are the possible configurations. So I think what I did tonight, though, in trying to break this down, I'm trying to do two things. Number one, give an explanation for the apparent order, the general order. Again, the word order is extremely subjective. I'm trying to do that. Plus, I'm trying to alter the way specifically even creationists think about these things, because I think they've kind of rode along the coattails of the evolutionary way of thinking for so long that they don't even necessarily understand when they're buying into an evolutionary assumption. So what I did do in all of that, though, is I gave a very fundamentally sound reason why the Cambrian appears underneath the Miocene, the Pliocene, whatever. I gave a very sound. Now, I didn't break it down. We didn't get that far. I understand that. Grayson's got a lot more questions, a lot more objections. I understand that. But I did get so far as to give a very distinct reason why the Cambrian should be at the bottom and not somewhere on top above a Miocene layer. I would not expect that in a global context. In Grayson's closing, he also wanted to point out this idea of the scale of megasequences. Here's another strong indication to me where I instantly knew Grayson has no idea how to put physical mechanisms together. I don't know exactly what the dynamics, the continuity between the mega sequences is. I don't need to know. What I do need to know before I start deciding any of Grayson's conclusions, what I do need to know is what was China, for instance, over on the Far East, what was its global conditions like in that region versus what was the US's condition like in that region. I don't have to expect the same thing on both sides of the world, because the physical configuration of where things are absolutely matters. And the specific motion that China does through, and it's drifted off its original location as well, they both have. But what were the specific circumstances?
30 seconds.
Thank you. What were the very specific circumstances that caused China and that half of the world to move the way it did and the US to move the way it did? this is one of my great big complaints against the evolutionist arguments, is that they hand wave things so much they can't slow down and look at the very specific details necessary to understand some of these things. So I'm laying the foundation now for how sorting begins to happen early, how you can absolutely determine why the Cambrian should appear towards the bottom, why the Miocene should be at the top. And so I'll yield there, and then hopefully we can flesh out some more during the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, TRock and Grayson, thank you for your concluding statements. This has been another engaging part to our two-part debate event. Hard to believe we're going on 4 hours and 10 minutes. So Grayson, way to go.
I just want to ask one last rhetorical question, and I am interested in the answer. So it kind of sucks it has to be rhetorical because it's the last bit. But if, like TRock, McQueen, any of the creationists, I just hope that you can genuinely think about this question. Just genuinely just think about it. If you didn't have the Bible, right? If there was no such thing as the Bible or the Old Testament, and all we had was the natural world around us from which to gather evidence and make conclusions, would you conclude that the global flood happened 4,400 years ago or whatever? Would you have the same conclusions that you do now without first reading the Bible? So just think about that. If there was a world where no Bible existed and all you had to do was look at the actual evidence in nature, would you have the same beliefs and conclusions that you do now? That's all I want people to think about. So I'll just leave it there.
Should I answer that, or do you want to just drop there and go?
I am interested in your answer. So
sure. Yeah, and I'll try and be super quick. Absolutely, I would believe in a worldwide flood and a young Earth if we did not have the biblical text. On a theological point, it's impossible that we would not have the biblical text, because written word is an integral part of foundational theology. If you're asking, and I know you are, from a more scientific perspective, the answer is still yes, because there are limitations to mathematical modeling in mechanical engineering, in electrical engineering, in chemical engineering. We make mathematical models for a reason, but we also build physical systems for a reason. And it's because we understand the limitations of mathematical models. I asked a guy with a PhD in mechanical engineering one time, completely outside the context of origins. I said, listen, we've got high-end FEA software. If you don't know what that is, it stands for finite element analysis. It's what's used for mechanical engineers and fluid dynamics engineers, all types of physical system studies. I said, at your level, do you prefer the FEA results or the physical model? And his answer was, we prefer the physical model. It tells us more than the FEA does. The point is, you cannot calculate your way into knowing what happened in the past, but there is plenty of actual physical evidence on the Earth that deep geological time has never happened.
Grayson, final question from McKee Sport. What happened to your finger?
Yeah, just suffice it to say that I fell and broke my finger. So it was actually during the same night that we did the debate with Sea Science, I think. So I was doing that debate. I didn't know that my finger was broken at the time. I knew it hurt, but it wasn't until the next day that I went in and got it looked at. So yeah, my finger's been broken for a little bit. Thanks for noticing.
Well, I hope it's coming along nicely, the healing process. And I know you did a debate the same night you broke your finger. So you're a champ. Appreciate it.